January 1945. A thin wind cut across the open yard as trucks unloaded onto hard-packed earth, canvas flaps snapping like sails. The women who climbed down from the lorries moved with the measured slowness of exhausted machines, faces drawn, shoulders narrow beneath coats that had once been uniforms. Their boots were caked in mud. Their hair, where it showed, hung in filthy strands. Some held small cloth bags close to their chests, as if the fabric itself contained their names. If you want to hear the whole story, stay until the end, subscribe and like. They had been traveling for days, then weeks, or so many days that counting made no difference. Rumors had suggested brutality here. The word captor had carried every unsaid weight: hunger, humiliation, fear. Behind the line of women, the trucks rattled and left, leaving a silence that smelled of diesel and winter. A sergeant in a greatcoat and a medic with steady hands met them at the canvas flap and spoke in clipped English that was intentionally calm. A woman who called herself Annalisa later wrote that the voice had sounded unsentimental but kind in a way that was foreign to them. Marta, younger than the others by years but older by experience, gripped her little cloth bag and watched the men approach as if they expected cruelty at any moment. They were led into a long, echoing hall hung with lanterns whose light turned the air into dusted gold. Benches ran down both sides. A stove hissed. The atmosphere was procedural, notes and checklists, and the careful rustle of paper. But the procedural face of the place was not the same as the rumor. The officers at the table spoke quietly. A woman in plain clothes moved between the lines, translating. An interpreter, the presence of a woman's voice amid men's uniforms, buffered the difference between strangers and human beings. She was careful where she stood, her hands never hovering over the women but offering a way to speak without exposing them to a stranger. The first task was simple and immediate: to determine who needed help the most. A medic ran a quick series of checks that had the economy of practice: pulse, skin, eyes, the bend of a wrist. He touched nothing more than necessary, his manner personal without being invasive. Where a wound required attention, he bandaged. Where dehydration was evident, he measured out warm fluids. A nurse murmured a sentence in German and passed a small cup, the steam from it mingling with the smell of antiseptic and wood smoke. Records from Allied processing stations of the period show that triage prioritized dehydration and exposure. Those measures likely saved lives that day, and the action felt intimate to the women who received it. Marta remembered the nurse leaning forward and saying something that meant, "You are not alone." It was a brief bridge across language and past allegiances. Annalisa, who had kept a pocket diary in pencil until the paper gave out, wrote later that she had not been able to carry more than a single dry biscuit on the march. The cup of hot liquid felt like a treaty between bodies. Small gestures like that, hands placed lightly on shoulders, turned faces away from the crowd so a woman could lift her skirt and have an old bruise examined in privacy, became the moral grammar of the place. On a raised table, an officer read out the obligations they would be afforded under the Geneva Rules, not as a sermon, but as an administrative certainty. Language had the effect of order. Names were recorded, small metal tags issued, and each woman was shown to a number. The official tone reassured some and puzzled others. For many of them, what mattered was not the clause, but the action that followed it. Blankets distributed from a neat stack, bread wrapped in paper, a small bar of soap. Cooks moved like a single organism in the adjacent building, pans clanking and steam rising to the rafters. The kitchen smelled of hot fat and cornbread. The sound was human and practical. Men and women passing ladles, a woman calling the names and numbers in a voice that was used to being obeyed for reasons of efficiency, not cruelty. A corporal barked orders, but his face softened when he saw an emaciated figure wobble toward the steam. Seeds of doubt in the prisoners' minds about what the occupying power intended began to open into questions the women had not the language to ask. Was this staged? Was it a trick? Or could an enemy, in some small place, do what was right? There were practical constraints. Rations were not endless. Supply lines strained. Records from field kitchens in that winter show reliance on staples: oatmeal, bread, powdered milk when it could be secured, sometimes hot stew made from salted vegetables and meat where available. The staff knew these limits. They also knew that a single hot meal could change the tone of a morning, the angle of a gaze. The cooks pressed a ladle into the hands of volunteers who formed a careful chain to the hall. The women sat on benches and cradled the paper plates, as if the paper itself might disintegrate. The first spoonfuls were tentative. It is hard to describe what dignity looks like in exhaustion. Not the absence of shame, but the return of appetite, the ability to chew without fear. A woman named Liesel closed her eyes and let the spoonful rest in her mouth. She tasted salt and something like the memory of home. At the back of the hall, a young woman with sunken cheeks wept so quietly that at first no one noticed. It was only when another woman reached out and covered the hand with her own that the room acknowledged emotion. The sergeant who had first met them walked between the rows with a measured gait, stopping sometimes to bend and listen. He kept his voice low when he spoke German, choosing simple phrases that could be understood. "Eat," he told them, "warm." The single-syllable commands made them seem more sure, and in moments when language failed, action made the promise. He insisted on privacy for certain examinations, offering the interpreter to sit outside the curtained space so a woman could speak without translators. It was a small courtesy, but for many women, the experience of any agency felt salvational. The night that followed was not cinematic in any grand sense. It was quiet and marked by small domestic sounds: the metallic clink of eating utensils, the soft sigh of a blanket being unwound, the muffled exchange of names in whispers. Some of the women tried to sleep. Others sat and stared at the stove, its dull orange glow like a tiny sun. The blanket each woman received was thin but dry. Many had not felt dry cloth against their skin in weeks. For Marta, the blanket felt like an answer. It wrapped around her shoulders and seemed to pull together a frayed outline of selfhood. In the morning, the relics of war, the tags, the dull uniforms, were still there. But the shape of the day had changed. A line formed for breakfast, and when the food arrived, it was different again. Porridge, hot and sweet in a way they had forgotten, and a piece of bread warm from the oven. The act of eating together in a place where the people who served you had once been called the enemy had an odd alchemy. Tears arrived as if they had been warming up in the night. The first woman to make a sound did not try to hide it. The others allowed themselves to weep too, not in shame, but as an overflow of exhausted relief. Later testimonies recorded decades after the war, oral histories preserved by universities and small museums, often centered this morning as the pivot. It was not only the sustenance that mattered, it was the way one person handed a spoon to another, the way a medic leaned in and said, clearly and simply, "You will be cared for." Acts like these accumulate moral credit. For women who had been taught to expect cruelty, the appearance of care unsettled an entire framework of expectation. Marta, who had once been a seamstress back home, later spoke about how she had looked at the cornbread and at the line of men and women who served it and felt the shape of a world she had not known existed. Anissa would later write, in the pencil smudge of an old page, that the meal was a small miracle of bread. Not all reactions were immediate trust. Suspicion lingered, like a residue on the tongue. Some of the women guarded their cloth bags jealously, holding the little personal items left to them as if by keeping them close they could preserve some continuity of identity. A hair ribbon, a scrap of a photograph, a button from a dress. All became anchors in a shifting landscape. The interpreter sat with several women who preferred to speak through her, facilitating modesty and interior confession. She invited them to speak about ailments, about small stories of their children at home, about the last thing they had eaten. These conversations were modest and human. They did not erase ideology, but they reintroduced personhood. Medical staff did more than bandage. They recorded stories on the margins of forms, notes not only about fever and malnutrition, but about memory. A nurse wrote that one woman, with a cough and a look of deep fatigue, told her, "I can remember my mother's voice when I am cold." The nurse replied by warming a blanket. The nurse did not attempt to interpret the meaning of the memory, only to make the cold stop. Such small acts were not propaganda. They were triage with compassion. There were administrative gestures that mattered for morale. Officers explained, in a way that recognized legal and human constraints, that certain things were being done because they had to be done. Registration, the issuing of blankets, the separation of those who needed hospital care. The presentation of procedure as a guarantee rather than a threat meant that what followed carried greater weight. A soldier who understood the law of war and who also understood the human cost of ignoring it acted in accordance with both convictions. When the men in uniform turned their disciplines toward care rather than humiliation, the women, slowly, cautiously, recalculated the meaning of power. An afternoon unfolded in small movements. A makeshift library of sorts was set up in a corner. Someone found a bundle of newspapers and a discarded novel. Women clustered and compared headlines with faces that betrayed hunger for news as much as for comfort. Others washed faces by basinfuls of water, passed around a bar of soap with the etiquette of shared blessing. Children's names were whispered, imagined names, remembered names. And for a while, the hall was a place where the past and a plausible near future could meet without the constant interference of fear. By the third day, a rhythm had established. Those whose conditions were more serious were moved to a small infirmary. The medics worked in shifts, marking temperatures and adjusting diets. A dietitian, if one could be so grandly named in improvised conditions, arranged small menus that used what was available. More milk for those who needed it, a modest portion of meat for those with the greatest protein deficit. Such choices were not luxury. They were deliberate, because staff knew from wartime experience that recovery required not only calories, but palatable food that would coax life back into muscles and memory. The story that became most told later, and the one that would shape the title under which these recollections resurfaced, hinged on a single morning, the first full hot meal eaten without the shadow of immediate fear. On that morning, the cooks managed to make a simple stew, thick with roots and a small amount of meat, and a tray of fresh bread. The smell preceded the food itself, drifting through the barracks like an emissary. Women who had not expected more than ration biscuits lifted their faces as if to a summons. When the plates were set down, something in the room shifted. The hush that fell was not sterile, but reverent. Marta remembered how her hands trembled as she took the spoon. She had not cried at the porridge months before. That morning, a single tear spilled, and then another, and soon others were wiping their faces. Not everyone wanted to be seen weeping, and others wept openly. The act of allowing oneself to weep in front of former enemies, and to have those enemies respond with nothing more than a covering hand or a turned face, refigured what it meant to be human in that moment. A corporal, unused to being the witness to such intimate scenes, stood a respectful distance away and let the women have their moment. Those small, self-controlled deferments of authority had a dignity all their own. In the weeks that followed, if weeks there were, or if time in the camps contracted into something more like measured breaths, recovery continued in fragile increments. Some women, given the chance to clean and change, began to mimic the small domesticities that had been uprooted by war. Mending clothes, trading buttons, reading aloud. The presence of a stove changed the cadence of days. Blankets were traded and received with gratitude. A cloth bag, once clung to like a talisman, was opened and its contents examined together. Privacy returned in small measures. A curtain allowed a woman to change without an audience. An interpreter took notes only when asked. Testimonies gathered after the war attested to the deep psychic effect of such routines. Women who had been prepared to hate by education, by propaganda, by the necessities of survival, found in the daily ordinary courtesy a reason to alter the stories they would keep. Annalisa later told a journalist that the kindness they received did not erase what we had been taught, but it did create a new place, small and stubborn, where tenderness could live. These testimonies do not claim moral conversion overnight. They record a layered process in which experience, more than ideology, remade expectations. Not all staff were saints. Within any large organization under stress, there were frictions. Supply shortages produced terse arguments. Exhausted men made poor decisions, and the weight of responsibility sometimes bent good intentions. But the prevailing actions were those of care. A sergeant who, in another context, might have been purely administrative, insisted on extra blankets for a group of older women. A cook who could have been indifferent spent an early hour kneading bread until it rose and smelled like a small promise. Those individual decisions, repeated and noticed, accumulated into a different ethic inside the camp. When the women finally left the processing center, some moved to different facilities, others repatriated after long delays. They carried back more than memories of hunger. They carried the proof that other human beings could choose care over cruelty, even in war. Marta returned to a landscape both devastated and familiar. She spoke to neighbors and sometimes told the story of the hot stew and the crackling stove in a manner that sounded like an admission of a hidden truth. Enemies could be humane. Annalisa, whose pencil diary had survived in smudged form, sat down years later and wrote an account that local historians would later use to corroborate the modest details: how blankets were distributed, how the interpreter arranged privacy, how the stove changed the room. The historian's impulse is to locate causality, to name systems, to map policies. The human impulse is to attend to the small kindness that became a hinge. Archival notes corroborate the patterns. Field kitchens were set up by the Quartermaster Corps. Medics followed triage guidelines established in common practice. Interpreters were employed to ensure proper processing under the laws of war. Records mention the distribution of blankets and the priority of the infirm. Those bureaucratic lines are real, but they intersected with personal choices. Choices that, in the end, made the difference between an arrival marked solely by fear and one marked by a fragile restoration. In subsequent years, some of the women returned to testify at community meetings, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with the matter-of-fact economy of someone who understood that the memory was a public good. Their accounts carried the careful tone of survival. They did not try to sanitize the past, but they wanted to preserve the recognition that small acts of care had changed them. Local memorials and small essays collected such memories as if they were rare seeds saved from a famine. The moral of such a story is not offered as a neat lesson, but as a quiet insistence. In the rubble of conflict, human dignity can be protected by the mundane. A hot bowl, a dry blanket, a respectful word. These are not merely comforts. They are reparative agents that restore orientation to persons who had been reduced to categories. The narrative does not pretend that kindness erases suffering or that a single meal compensates for the wider injuries of war. Instead, it shows that acts of mercy, when performed in consistency and with respect for privacy and personhood, have long shadows. They reshape memory and become the moments to which later generations return when they ask how ordinary people kept humanity alive. When Martha and Annalisa told their stories decades later, they did not claim heroism for their caretakers. They described plainly, and often with a dry laugh, the practical competence of cooks and medics who knew how to make a lasting impression by doing small things well. They described the dignity of a sergeant who turned his back at precisely the right moment to ensure privacy, of an interpreter who gave a woman the chance to speak without immediate public scrutiny. The details mattered because they were credible. A hand on a shoulder, a cup of warm liquid, a curtain drawn. Memory, like food, needs both sustenance and time to be digested. For those women, the process of integrating what had happened took years. Some found themselves telling the story only to close friends. Others wrote letters. A few agreed to interviews that would be archived for posterity. In every account, the same core returned. The morning of the first full meal, the stove's glow, the blanket's weight, images that formed a coherent arc from fear to fragile restoration. The last image most survivors carried was not grand but ordinary. A woman sitting at a bench with a paper plate in front of her, steam rising, and a hand reaching across to lay over her own. It was not a heroic tableau, but a human one, a private reconciliation with the fact that someone had chosen to offer warmth. In the years after the war, as Europe rebuilt and narratives hardened into politics, such memories circulated as small corrections to sweeping statements. They did not deny the vastness of suffering, but insisted on the presence of particular human acts that made suffering bearable. Those who curated wartime archives often remarked on the subtlety of such accounts. They asked, "What makes a memory endure?" The answer given by many of the women themselves was simple: dignity. When institutions acted to preserve it, even modestly, people remembered. The material evidence, blanket lists, ration notes, registration cards, exist in dusty files. The human evidence exists in the way a woman later traced her fingers over the cloth of a little bag and remembered that someone had treated her as a person. The story of these German women is not an isolated anecdote. It is part of a pattern discovered when historians turned their attention from grand strategy to everyday encounters. It reveals that in the machinery of war, individual choices matter. A cook who fed one woman extra porridge did not alter the course of military history, but she altered the interior world of a person who would go on to live, remember, and tell. Those small, steady acts of mercy functioned as a kind of moral repair kit, simple, practical, and humane. And so the final measure of that morning, the one that people returned to in letters and interviews and public recollections, was not the content of the stew or the type of blanket, but the restoration of an interior possibility. The possibility that another person might act with care even when circumstances permitted otherwise. Marta lived with that possibility for the rest of her days. Annalisa carried it in a pocket of paper pages that later found a home in an archive. Their testimony invites us to notice the ordinary acts that resist the worst impulses of war and to preserve those notices as part of the larger record. What remained, in the end, was memory shaped not by propaganda, but by small, repeated evidence. Warm bread, a turned face, a curtained space. Those were the things that made women who had gone a week without food break down into tears at a simple, first hot meal. They were not tears of gratitude alone. They were tears of recalibration, proof that amid the machinery of conflict, someone had chosen a different path. If this story moved you and you want to keep discovering hidden moments like these, share it and subscribe to continue exploring the quieter edges of history. In the years that followed, the particulars of that morning became a kind of grammar for both women. They taught others how to speak of care without turning it into rumor or spectacle. When a school teacher asked Marta to tell the story to her class, Marta did not dramatize. She named objects, spoons, a chipped basin, the rustle of a blanket, and let the children supply the rest with their faces. Annalisa, more methodical by temperament, began to collect the scraps that stayed with her. Ration cards folded with a precise crease, a scrap of cloth she could not throw away, a note written in a hand that had been hurried but not cruel. She kept them in the pocket of an old coat, and in winter months she would take them out and hold them until their edges smoothed again beneath her thumb. Both women lived under the persistent shadow of what had been lost. Loss shaped their habits. Martha learned to measure kindness in small daily increments, how often a neighbor stopped by, whether a baker saved the heel of bread, the steadiness of a friend who would, without announcement, bring a pot the first time a new widow needed attention. Annalisa kept a ledger in her head of people who had given a moment and of those who had not. She cataloged the human economy of favors paid forward or withheld. Their memories did not sit in neat memorials. They threaded through meals, through the practice of making tea for an uncle on a rainy afternoon, or of drawing a curtain for a woman who preferred to cry in private. Archivists, when they encountered these small objects in lists, often felt at once humbled and puzzled. How should a museum narrate the life of a broken spoon? How should a historian weigh the testimony of a woman who remembered the precise pitch of a sergeant's voice as he turned away? The answer, as Marta and Annalisa would insist, lay not in the spoon alone, but in the events that clustered around it. The hand that chose to place the spoon carefully on a table set for one. The sergeant who understood privacy as an ethical act rather than as a mere formality. Those curators who listened with patience began to reshape exhibits. Instead of only maps and strategies, they made room for a tent corner with a single blanket and a plate, for the card on which a name was written in a tucked, uncertain script. Visitors stood closer to those humble displays. Something in them required the visitor's own small imagination to complete the story. The practice of remembering also altered relationships within families. Marta's sons learned not to pry at their mother's silence, but to sit where she had once sat and to keep a silence of their own, which sometimes opened the space for a single sentence: "The woman with the blue scarf." Annalisa's daughter, who had been a child at the time of the events, could never quite match her mother's calm when telling the details. She would become animated when she spoke of the cook who refused to record a woman's name on a list because she feared the name might invite a later claim. That cook's refusal, a small act of risk, became for the family a standard by which to measure courage. There were, of course, darker echoes. Both women carried an uneasy knowledge of what might have been, alternate lives cut short, opportunities never taken. Once, in the quiet of a late afternoon, Marta confessed to a friend that sometimes she felt guilty for laughing with neighbors who had not known the same privations. "It is as if I betrayed those who did not survive by finding warmth," she said. Her friend took her hand and named the only useful truth: that to honor those who did not survive was not to remain frozen in grief, but to carry forward the ordinary virtues that had preserved life itself. They spoke then of obligations that were not public duties, but incarnated choices. Offer your bread when asked. Stand aside for privacy. Keep a hand at the shoulder when another needs the proof of presence. Annalisa, practiced at writing, turned part of her inward ledger into a careful set of letters, some to people she had known, some to unknown readers, describing the exact gestures she associated with dignity. She wrote to a man whose handwriting had stayed behind on a ration card, thanking him for a decision whose consequences he would never have imagined. She wrote to a cook in a barracks she had long admired, explaining how that small extra portion of porridge had recalibrated a woman's sense of self. Many of those letters were returned unopened or lost. Some, later, were included in a small pamphlet compiled by a local historical society, and through that pamphlet, the stories reached the hands of people who had never lived through the winter of hunger, but who nonetheless could learn the manners of responsibility. As the decades advanced, the women who had once depended on the kindness of strangers aged into a demographic that museums began to seek out. Exhibitions traveled to towns and villages, and younger curators, eager to correct the grand narratives, asked for interviews. Marta and Annalisa, then in their 70s and 80s, answered with the particular modesty of those who still believed memory to be a thing entrusted, not displayed. They sat before microphones and in front of reporters, and, more often, in a small study where a single graduate student took down sentences with the careful deference of someone handling old glass. They refused sensationalism. When asked to relive terror, they instead told of routine acts, the precise temperature of soup that did not scald but warmed, the manner in which a blanket could be folded to seem like a gift rather than charity. That restraint affected those who recorded them. Scholars learned to treat testimony as a form of stewardship, not only to extract facts, but to preserve the context in which a woman had chosen to trust, to forgive, to accept help. A generation of historians began to publish articles that argued for a different metric of wartime experience, one that balanced the calculus of loss with the ledger of human repair. These works did not seek to minimize atrocity. They aimed to expand understanding, to show that what historians had often dismissed as anecdote could be, in fact, a source of moral clarity. The moral clarity endured in surprising ways. In a small town where Marta eventually settled, a group of women who ran a soup kitchen used her story to shape their practice. They adopted a policy that honored privacy, a curtained corner, a small plate set apart from the rest. They trained volunteers to offer a hand over the shoulder and to speak low so that those who came would not be announced in a way that had the power to shame. They placed no plaques announcing this debt to history. Instead, they taught volunteers to notice the temperature of the soup and the straightness of a chair back. When asked why they were so careful, one of the volunteers answered simply, "We do not risk making dignity an afterthought." For Annalisa, the archive became a home of another sort. She entrusted her papers to a modest institution, a room with sturdy shelves and windows that let in the northern light. A curator named Emile, who had been trained to respect the ordinary as a source of truth, cataloged each item with tenderness. He would insist, whenever giving a tour, that visitors lay down their own schedules and let the objects speak slowly. He taught school groups to stand silently for a minute before opening a case, as if silence itself were a way of learning to hear. On one occasion, a young teacher held up a single paper plate, stained with a ghost of broth, and asked her students what could be learned from such a thing. One boy answered, after thinking, that someone thought we were still worth feeding. The teacher allowed the answer to hang between them like a benediction. In public debates about memory, these small objects and stories occasionally took on symbolic weight. Politicians and pundits argued over monuments and national narratives, but the testimonies of Marta and Annalisa supplied a countervailing suggestion that memory must account for the micro-practices of care if it is to be honest. In hearings and schoolrooms, in small civic councils where plaques were approved, people quoted the women not to settle policy, but to remind themselves that policies without attention to the practical dignity of persons could be hollow. That insistence, that institutions be judged by how they preserve private worth, slowed no historian's chronology, but deepened the terms of historical judgment. The last time Marta and Annalisa were together, a meeting arranged by a granddaughter who thought it would be proper to reunite two women bound by the same once humble salvation. They sat opposite one another in a sunlit kitchen. On the table lay a paper plate, steam rising faintly from a small slice of warm bread. Neither woman felt the need for embellishment. They placed their hands over the plate as if blessing it. For a long moment, neither spoke. When words finally came, they were simple and offered neither consolation nor triumph. "We were given bread," Marta said. "We were given space," Annalisa replied. They smiled in recognition of the different but complementary gifts. Those who would later write about them preferred to capture that quiet moment as emblem rather than to dramatize it. Photographs showed two elderly women sitting with a plate between them, an image that could be captioned in many ways, but which always returned the viewer to the truth that the ordinary had preserved the possibility of life. Students who visited the archive or the local center often left with a small list of instructions. Fold the blanket so it feels like a gift. Do not ask a woman in public what she prefers. Keep a cup of warm liquid at the ready for the person who needs it. The list read like practical theology, and it traveled into families and into the manuals of volunteers. In the end, the narrative these women passed on was not a lesson of heroism, but of attention. It taught that to preserve dignity, one need not perform grand acts, only to be faithful in small ones. Children who had never seen war learned by virtue of simple practices that worth can be defended in quiet ways, by a curtain drawn at the right instant, by a hand placed on a shoulder without comment, by extra porridge given without record. The list read like practical theology, and it traveled into families and into the manuals of volunteers. In the end, the narrative these women passed on was not a lesson of heroism, but of attention. It taught that to preserve dignity, one need not perform grand acts, only to be faithful in small ones. Children who had never seen war learned, by virtue of simple practices, that worth can be defended in quiet ways, by a curtain drawn at the right instant, by a hand placed on a shoulder without comment, by extra porridge given without record. One afternoon, years after the two women had become names in catalogs and in gentle lectures, a young woman sat on a bench near the town square. She had come from town to attend a seminar about memory, but she had arrived early and had bought a piece of bread from a baker who kept his oven lit late into the evening. The bread steamed in the small paper plate on her lap. Across from her sat another young woman, her face weary from a day's work. For a while they ate in companionable silence, and then, without preamble, the first woman reached out and covered the second woman's hand with her own. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture, no speech, no public acknowledgement. It was simply an offering of warmth, the sort of movement that had saved lives in harsher times, and that, in its modesty, kept alive an ethical habit. The moment passed as moments do, quietly, without fanfare, but it carried in itself the long history of choices that allowed dignity to survive. If there is a moral to be drawn from Marta and Annalisa's lives, it is not a rule, but a practice. Pay attention, offer warmth, protect privacy, and, when possible, choose the small act that will let another person retain the sense of being a person rather than a number. These are not solutions to the great violences of history, but they are the stitches by which communities mend. That afternoon, as the sun slanted low and the steam curled upward from the paper plate, a passerby paused and watched only long enough to realize that something ordinary had been done well. Perhaps she nodded to herself, perhaps she walked on without thinking further, and that is precisely how these things are meant to travel. They do not need proclamations, they need to be performed again, one hand, one plate, one modest curtain at a time. The memory of those who once sat at benches with steam rising from their food is preserved not only in archives and essays, but in the quiet habits of people who remember to be careful with one another. The seminar began with a slide of an old photograph. The two women, the paper plate between them, the late light catching on their knuckles. The room was not large. Folding chairs, a whiteboard with neat cursive notes, a kettle murmuring in the corner. People had come for different reasons, some to learn about archives, some to fulfill a course requirement, some because the title, Practices of Preservation, had sounded like an answer to a private unease. The lecturer, a woman whose hair had gone silver in a way that made her seem both younger and older at once, spoke not of grand narratives, but of the protocols that grow out of attention. History, she said, is often measured by its monuments, but monuments forget the gestures that allow persons to stay persons. Preservation is not only about records, it is about restraint. The small withholding, the quick cover of a hand, the unremarked bowl of stew left at a doorstep. These are practices, and practices can be taught. She spoke of manuals, of lists once scribbled in margins and later formalized into training sessions. There was a dry laugh among some listeners when she mentioned the idea of volunteer etiquette, as if politeness needed institutional permission. But she traced the lineage of those little rules. Fold the blanket so it looks like a gift, offer the warm drink without question, never read aloud a note found in someone's pocket, and the laughter subsided. What she called etiquette, the room began to understand as moral craft, ways of moving among the vulnerable without diminishing them. Across the aisle, the young woman from the square watched the photograph with a steadiness that made the lecturer glance at her once, then return to the notes. She had not known, when she had wrapped her hand over that stranger's glove, that she was participating in a tradition with a name. She had not needed the name. For her, the habit was muscle memory already forming, small, precise, deliberate. After the talk, people clustered by the table of pamphlets, small things with bullet points and archaic typefaces, and one of the archivists, a man who smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper glue, offered her a copy. "You might like to see the case files," he said. "They aren't sensational, mostly lists and invoices and the kinds of receipts you expect. But there's correspondence, too. Notes from women who were taught how to hide bread beneath quilts, how to knot a curtain so a window could be opened for a breath without revealing the room." She turned the pamphlet over in her hands, feeling the texture of the paper. There was a photograph pasted inside, a younger Marta, hair pinned back in a way the present Marta never bothered with, handing a wrapped piece of bread to a child. The caption was modest. "Gifts without record," it read. The young woman tilted her head, thinking of the baker who kept his oven lit late, of steam that would curl up and be gone. When she left, the pamphlet folded into her pocket like a promise. Outside, the town had the slow rhythms of places that have known trauma and returned to the work of keeping simple things intact. The baker who had made the bread for the bench was open early and late. He had learned to make loaves that kept their warmth and to wrap them in paper that caught the steam just so. He did not ask why someone wanted an extra piece. He wrapped it and slid it into the bag with a palm pressed briefly against the paper, a private benediction. Customers watched him do this and, in their various ways, began to do it too. A child peered from behind a display of sweet rolls and was taught by the clerk to fold the wrapper in on itself and tuck it under an arm so it would not be obvious who had it. The child learned to move quietly, to make small, invisible acts. Volunteers at the center met every month in the back room where stacks of blankets were folded like low altars. They practiced the motions the way a choir might rehearse a single phrase until it became second nature. There was a ritual of holding a blanket by its corners and thinking, for a heartbeat, of the person it would warm. A new volunteer, recently arrived from a different city, confessed one evening that she had been afraid, at first, of being intrusive, of asking the wrong question or revealing too much concern. The older women laughed softly and showed her how to pour tea without fixing her gaze on a face, how to let a silence remain unfilled for a beat too long so that another person might fill it if they wished. The center kept a notebook, nothing official, mainly a ledger the size of a prayer book, where volunteers wrote no names but recorded odd, instructive notes. Curtain left unlatched, chance for fresh air. Bread given, no receipt, left on windowsill. Child told story, no probing afterward. Over time, patterns emerged. People who read the ledger learned not to read into the lives of those they served. They carried the entries not as rules to be enforced, but as habits to be folded into their days. What the institution could codify, however, it could not contain entirely. There were always small acts that refused instruction. A woman once left a knitted cap on a park bench with a note pinned inside that read, simply, "Take mine until yours is dry." No one could say whose hands had made the cap or why it had been left that day. It traveled from one coat to another until, months later, someone brought it to the thrift shelf with a different knot in it and a loosened thread. Such things, lending, taking, returning, moved through social spaces like gossip, unnoticed until their absence was felt. Marta and Annalise's names lived in two registers, the official, where they became chapters and footnotes, and the lived, where they were gestures that people kept in mind like a favorite phrase. Scholars debated the extent to which private acts could influence public life. Journalists made their narratives tidy. But in the laundromats, at the corner stores, and in the small rooms of houses where people mended socks by lamplight, the practice of attention continued without needing to be declared. It was not that institutions were worthless. They organized resources, made training possible, preserved letters. It was that salvation, as those who remembered it most plainly would say, was quieter than a policy paper. Years later, a boy who had once been the child to whom Marta had given bread grew up to be a municipal nurse. He worked at odd hours, carrying a thermos and a towel in the back of his car. He had no plaque to remind him of his first lesson, only the reflex to press a towel into the hands of someone shivering on a bench rather than to ask for identification. When he stopped by the baker's shop to buy a loaf, the baker wrapped it without ceremony and slid it into his bag. They had not planned this choreography. It had arrived by way of memory, by way of seeing one person choose a small kindness and deciding to do the same. The granddaughter, who had arranged Marta and Annalise's last meeting, continued, in her older age, to organize quiet reunions and to counsel volunteers on discretion. She kept a folder of things, a photograph, photocopies of letters, a ribbon of hair tucked into a book. When asked why she held on to such small relics, she would say only that memories were like seeds. You plant them, she told a new volunteer, and you hope they sprout sideways, into habits, into ways of moving through a room. She made a small rule for herself: never announce what she would do for another person until after it was done. The town's archives received visitors who came expecting to see the machinery of memory: documents, dates, lists of donors. They often left carrying, instead, a sense of the slowness necessary to keep a person intact. A curator once observed a group of teenagers who, as part of a school project, spent a day cataloging blankets and later used their allowance to buy a new kettle for the center. The teenagers did not do this because they read a treatise on dignity. They did it because they had been taught to fold a blanket as if it were a gift, and because that fold had moved them in a way books could not. Not every narrative ended well. There were those who said that small acts could not withstand the pressures of politics or the greed of townsfolk who wished to see profit where kindness once was. There were instances in the record of betrayals, lists stolen, curtains used to hide other things, trust misapplied. The ledger, for all its modesty, recorded failures as well as successes. But even the failures taught lessons: the need for humility in practice, the danger of making heroes of those who had only done what was humanly possible. On a winter morning, a child returned a plate to the center with crumbs smoothed as if it had been a tiny altar. "Someone gave me this," the child said, blunt as a bell. "I wanted you to have it back." The volunteers laughed, half crying, and rearranged the blankets. The act required no fanfare, only a cup of tea and an agreeing to continue. Outside, seasons turned in predictable ways. The trees shed, the river rose and fell, bread cooled in the windows. The bench by the square remained a place where strangers met without being asked for reasons. Steam rose from paper plates and disappeared into the afternoon air. People practicing the small arts of attention went their ways, sometimes carrying pamphlets, sometimes carrying nothing at all, but a habit of gentle restraint. Those who noticed them might say later that it was a long, necessary kindness that had kept a town from forgetting its people. And so the ordinary committed itself, day after day, into the hands of those who would not make spectacle of mercy. The tradition did not require monuments, it required return. It asked, simply, that one person after another remember how to hand over warmth without demand, how to fold privacy like a promise, how to cover a plate with a palm and leave without explanation. These were not grand defenses against calamity, they were the narrow stitches by which a community kept itself from coming apart. The young woman who had been on the bench went home and taught her sister to fold a blanket in the way Marta once had. The baker continued to warm loaves late into the night. The lecturer slid another photograph into the file and began planning the next seminar, not to proclaim doctrine, but to remind people of the smallness of what keeps us humane. In those small repetitions, the memory worked itself further into common life, until perhaps one day a stranger in another town would move as if acting from some distant script, a hand covering another's in winter, a plate of bread left at a door, and would not know from whom the motion came, only that it was the right thing to do. The steam rose, the plate cooled. The town continued, held together by gestures that required no witnesses.